Open your Bibles to the book of Jonah. That's where we're going to be camped out here tonight. Kind of get down here with you tonight where I can walk around. I kind of feel trapped up there sometimes. I ain't got enough room to move around, so sometimes I like to get down here. I've told Julie before, of all these years of preaching, I've never fell off a pulpit, but I've come mighty close. I think I was saying something to Matt or Al one about it the other day, and I think he agreed. There's been several times where that foot has got right on the edge, and I've almost went. Somehow I've stayed up there. But anyway, I'm going to be down here with you tonight, and we'll talk about Jonah for a little bit. It's been a while since I've mentioned this. But there's a lot of responsibility here at this congregation. It is at any congregation for that matter. But with the number of people we have, the number of classes, the number of children we have, I was talking with Debbie tonight just about all the children we have. We're so blessed with so many kids. But with that comes a lot of responsibility. And we need teachers, and we need people to fulfill those roles and fulfill those positions and wherever we can to teach them. And really and truly for this size congregation, we need more teachers to run those kids through and to relieve each other so that other teachers can maybe get in an adult class of some nature. So there's just a lot of opportunity to serve in that nature. There's a lot of opportunity to serve in a lot of different ways, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in the actual service. And as always, we need more elders. You all know that just as well as I do. We need more elders, especially with a flock the size of our congregation here. We need more elders, and we have qualified men. We need more deacons. We're doing pretty good in a lot of things, but we really need to improve that. And it's not saying that from a standpoint of fussing. It's just saying that from the standpoint of we need to all strive to encourage each other, regardless of what role it is, to step up and to do what we can for God. Because as we talked about this morning, the importance of the home is very important. But really from there, we make the church stronger. And it's not only what we do at home, but what we do here is so vitally important as well as we serve God. So as we think about those different roles that we can fill, I'm not really focusing on one, but as we think about those roles that we can fill in serving God here at this congregation and really anywhere that we may go, whether it's at home or in our jobs or out in society, there's always duties that we have to do. So we're going to focus on the word duty tonight, and I want you to all think about it. I'm thinking about myself as well. But let's think about, are we fulfilling our duty to God? In other words, the abilities we have, what God has blessed us to be able to do, are we doing that? And let's think about that from the standpoint of Jonah here tonight. In Jonah chapter 1, if you want to follow along with me there, we're just going to focus on really the first 3 verses and then one verse right at the end of chapter 2 here in just a little bit as we close. But in Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise and go to Nineveh." It's very simple what he asked him to do. Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Now, a little bit of background to that. The Ninevites were enemies of God's people. They were not God's people. They were not Hebrew people. In fact, they were an evil nation overall, and they were not of God's people. So automatically there would have been a tension there between anybody who was somebody of God's people as opposed to them. So that's an issue already. It's really a non-issue with God. It should have been a non-issue with Jonah, but it was. There was a racial, traditional, customary thing going on there that we'll point out in just a moment. Okay? But again, just think about that, and we'll look at it in the map here in just a little bit. Verse 3 says, "But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, went down into it to go with him to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." So what you see as the book of Jonah opens up is this. There is dust coming off Jonah's feet. And it is not dust to do God's will. It is dust to get as far away from God as he can possibly get. In other words, to get as far away from Nineveh as he can get. So Jonah, as you might say, Jonah has cut a trail. And it's not the trail he needs to cut. And what we really see happening here as this book opens is we see somebody who is fleeing from their duty. a clear duty that God has given him the ability to do, Jonah has said, I don't want to do it, I'm out. And he cuts a trail. That is a huge problem. That is something that you and I don't need to fall into. If we realize that we have the ability to do something, as I've always said, the desire really should be a given, because as we're going to look at in just a moment from a perspective standpoint, God has given us his best. The question is, are we giving him ours? In everything, regardless of what it is that we can do. So rather than having a man running for God, you got a man running from God. And we don't want to be there. So we're going to talk about this duty thing tonight. Now, I think I've showed you this map before. I've used it several times over the years. There's a lot of different maps you can use that kind of shows what Jonah's doing here. This is probably one of my favorite. It actually gives you a mileage. Tarshish was somewhere in this area, and I've heard people kind of argue as to where it was at, but what's not listed here is this sea. Obviously, this is the Mediterranean. This would be the area of Canaan. Nineveh's up here, which is about 500 miles from where he was at the time that God told him to get here. And then you've got Joppa down here. So Jonah is literally going as far, he's almost off the map, okay? He's going as far away from what God tells him to do as he can possibly get. Why? Why would he do that when his command was crystal clear? Well, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Talk about how some of the things that the devil actually allows to happen pretty easy really kind of makes it very easy to run from God if we want to. But we have a duty. We have a duty to fulfill to God, the one that which Jonah was not very worried about. But what does the Bible say? One of the most common sense verses that we can look at is Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13. Let's hear the summary of it all, the conclusion of all of it. And what is it? When we think about all the things that Solomon says, when we think about all the things that's in the book of Ecclesiastes, when you sum it all up, when you look at life as a whole, what do you find? Fear God and keep his commandments, fulfill our duty. What God has given us the ability to do, what he expects of us. For that is man's all. In other words, that's all God expects. To just do what we can do. Now we're going to look at two verses later on tonight. The word duty actually doesn't show up a lot in the New Testament, but ironically enough, our duty is found on every page. But the word duty itself doesn't really show up a lot, but when it does show up, it comes from the Greek word ophilio, which basically means, and I think this is very important because it's kind of ironic how Jonah comes full circle and says what he does towards the end of the book, and it ties right into the definition of the word duty. The word duty means to owe. It brings into mind a debt that has to be paid. A debt that we owe God. Why? We'll look at that in just a moment. But the word means to owe or to be under obligation. So when you think about it, life itself is not really about pleasure. As many would argue the difference, but it's really not. It's not about popularity. But our life, going back to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, our life is about fulfilling our duty. And it is about doing what God expects us to do. So when you really look at the definition, what God expects of us, and you look at the opposite side of it, when we don't fulfill our duty, we're defaulting on our debt. And I think you and I know the problems with defaulting on debt in our social and economical, financial lives. It's not going to be a good thing, is it? It's a more serious thing with God. Because it doesn't have just monetary consequences, it has eternal consequences. Defaulting on debt's a serious thing, and not keeping our obligations to God is a huge problem. So let's understand that from the get-go, and from that we'll build what we're going to say the rest of the lesson tonight. Think about these things. All of us, myself included, we all have things that God expects of us. What are they? I think you know. The question is, are we doing them? So, here's the perspective that we need to have. In everything that we can do, whatever our hand finds to do, doing all of our might, this is why. God has given us his Son. And I think we always have to keep this center stage in our lives. God has given us his Son, and Peter points this out. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 18. Knowing that we were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold. In other words, God didn't purchase us with money. Okay? He bought us back. He purchased us with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without spot or without blemish or without spot. So in other words, God gave us His Son to purchase us, to buy us back from Satan, to buy us back from eternal damnation. He bought us back with His Son's blood, every one of us. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means a lot. And we can say a lot about it, but the point is that God gave us His best. He has given us His best in every way, form, and fashion as far as our service to Him. Do you not agree that we owe Him our best? I think we can all at least agree on that. We owe Him our best, which goes right back to our duty. The fact that we were bought at a price, are we glorifying God in our body and in our spirit, which are God's, and are we doing it according to what He needs you and I to do? Are we doing that? Let's think about that tonight. What I want to do first is look at Jonah and his duty, and then we'll go from there. And there's several things that really jumps off the pages of the book of Jonah when you really start looking at it. God's command to Jonah was just about as clear as it could be. But what I want you to understand is that what God commanded him to do was his duty. In the same way that God commands us to do things, and just like in the line of the parable of the talents, when we see that it's our ability to be able to do something, we're blessed with that, then God expects us to use that, to not bury that, or to not push that aside. God's command is our duty. You really can't dodge that, and we're going to point that out as well. But God was clear to Jonah. I mean, just about as clear as you could be. I mean, any child can understand what He asked Jonah to do. Go to Nineveh. Tell them they're wrong. I understand their wickedness and I want them to be better. Go to them. It's pretty simple. He didn't write him a novel, didn't give him all these long, extensive instructions to go to Nineveh. It was pretty simple. He said, I just need you to go up there and tell them that they're in sin and they need to repent. Very simple. But Jonah didn't agree with it, did he? In fact, Jonah disagreed with it tremendously, and he didn't like anything about what God commanded him to do. And I've heard different opinions and thoughts as to maybe why he didn't agree with that, to maybe why he lacked the desire, or why it was so disagreeable and distasteful to him. And we're going to look at some of them. I want you to think about them. I've heard where some suggested that maybe the distance to Nineveh was a challenge to Jonah because it was mountainous, it was rugged country, and maybe the distance was an issue. I don't agree with that because Tarshish was a whole lot further than Nineveh. And if he was willing to get in a boat, and again, we talk about Paul and a lot of the shipwrecks and stuff he had. There was a lot of dangers to that. But if he was willing to go over 2,000 miles to Tarshish, then Nineveh was just a hop, skip, and a jump. So I don't agree that was the issue. Maybe it was, but he sure didn't mind going on a longer trip to evade God. But as you look deeper into it, as I said earlier, we're talking about the Assyrians here. There was a lot of prejudice between God's people and these Assyrians. I've heard and read where some suggested that had he gone, or obviously he did, but in their minds, if he went and did that, and these people repented, then Jonah would be looked at as a traitor because he helped an ungodly nation. Maybe that was a vital point, but did it matter? No, because God gave him a command. Maybe sometimes, and to some degrees, maybe it was a lack of love. Maybe the task was unpleasant. Maybe he felt like he wasn't the guy for the job. Maybe it was the idea of, I can't. But here's the point. Regardless of why he didn't want to go, it didn't change God's command, did it? Just because Jonah didn't want to, just because he said, well, that's not really my desire, didn't change a thing. Not a thing. God still expected Jonah to do that. And it's ironic, or not really ironic, but it's almost kind of funny. As soon as Jonah kind of comes around and repents, the first thing God says, I want you to go to Nineveh. He didn't wait around. As soon as Jonah got his mind straight, he went right back to him and said, I want you to go to Nineveh. So his feelings in the beginning there didn't change what God expected him to do. And I don't believe it does with us either. If God has given us the ability to do something, then whatever reason we come up with to not do it, does it really change that much? We need to think about that. I believe all of our situations are different, and obviously there's things worked into that, but in the whole scheme of things, God still needs to do His will. You know what I think Jonah, the main reason he sought to escape, I think it was a condition of his heart. I don't claim to be able to read anybody's hearts. If any of us claim to be able to do that, I think we're stepping in somebody's shoes that we don't belong to be in. But I think it's safe to say that Jonah's heart was not in it, because had he loved everybody, had he loved enemies in the way that we're supposed to, he'd have been okay with going. But he didn't. In fact, Jonah was unlike Samuel. As God called on Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 4 and 10, God called him twice. First time Samuel said, "Here am I," or "Here I am." He called to him again and he said, "Speak, for I'm listening. I'm here." Samuel was ready to go. Whatever God, again, what's funny about that is that he hadn't really given much instruction yet. He just called him. He didn't even wait around to see what the task was. He just said, "I'm here and I'm listening. What do you need me to do?" Isaiah was the same way. As things are being looked over and God is considering the condition of His people, and the questions brought up, well, who's going to stand up and do this? Well, Isaiah was quick to raise his hand and say, "Well, here I am. Why not send me?" But you don't see that in Jonah. Because Jonah was not thinking about God's will. Jonah was not thinking about people in need, as maybe Samuel was or Isaiah was. Jonah was thinking about Jonah. But yet again, the command was clear and it didn't change anything, did it? Here's what's really interesting about this story. Jonah's evasion. It is amazing to me how easy that was. And I believe there's a reason why that was so easy, and I think you'll agree as we look at this, it can be easy for us to dodge too. I want you to notice how conducive things were to his plan. He found a ship. Now, I don't know how many ships they had in Tarshish. But the fact that was unplanned, he hadn't scheduled anything, he didn't book his journey, so to speak. He didn't book his cruise months ahead. It just happened to be a ship with enough room on it for him to jump on it right quick. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Very conducive to what he wanted to do. And just so happened to be that ship was going to where he wanted to go. Maybe not that it was Tarshish, but as far away from God as he could get, as far away from his duty as he could get. That's exactly where that ship was going. How convenient that a ship would be headed in that direction. Isn't that something? You might say, well, boy, Jonah was a lucky guy. He really had it going for him, or was he? I don't know what it cost to get on a ship back then, but for whatever reason, he had enough money with him to do that. There was room on the ship, wasn't full, had enough space for him down in the ship, and that's where he went. It is amazing how accommodating that Satan can be when we want to go away from God rather than to God. You may say, well, how do you know that Satan's accommodating? Well, the Bible tells us that. What did Jesus say in Matthew 7 and verse 13? He wants us to enter by the narrow gate. Because that's where we need to go. It may be tough, it may be hard, but the other way is wide, it's broad. There are many who go by it. Why? Because it's easy. It's conducive to what they want to do, which is go away from God. And who makes that way? Satan does. It is amazing how easy Satan will make it to run from God when we decide we want to run from God. I don't think all those things just fell into place just by happenstance. No. Satan saw a guy who didn't want to do God's will, and he said, here's your ship, here's your spot, here's your place. Have at it, buddy. And he still works the same way today. Do you agree? I think so. I think so. So, Jonah's command was very clear, and it's very clear how easily it worked out for him to dodge that. But again, did it change what God expected of him? Not at all. So here's ours. We can talk about Jonah all day. We'll come back to him in a little bit. What about our command and our duty? As I said earlier, the word duty is really only used as far as in the King James and in the New Testament. The word itself is only used twice in the New Testament. We've looked at the definition, but notice the verses here. Luke 17 and in verse 10. Luke 17 and verse 10 says, so likewise, when you have done all these things which you're commanded to do, say we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. Again, that Greek word means to owe or to be obligated. Same as it does in Romans chapter 15, verse 27. If the Gentiles have been partakers of spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things. then again, kind of different topics than what we're focusing on, but the word duty means what it means right there. And somebody might say, well, how can you really do a lesson on duty when you only find it on 2 pages? Well, it's more than on 2 pages, because as we read through the authority of the new law, whether it's in the Gospels or ultimately in the book of Acts and all the letters to the churches and to individuals, we find our duty on every page of the New Testament on what God expects us to do. Obviously, some pages may apply to me or to you or to us more than others, but we find what God expects of us throughout the whole entire thing. So it's all over the new law. It's all over what we are under. So here's the point that we need to consider. One of the most simple verses in the New Testament. We talk a lot about all the sins that'll cause you to be lost. I've always thought and always felt that maybe in some ways it's not what we are doing that will cause us to be lost as much as it is what we are not doing. Those sins of omission are dangerous, folks. It scares the life out of me. And when you really start thinking about it, being afraid of the sins of omission will really keep you working in the right direction. Because if you don't think about constantly what God expects of us, it might be that we omit doing it altogether. What does James say? James chapter 4 and verse 17 says, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. So what's the point we make in that? Well, the point's pretty simple. If we choose not to do what we know we can do, then what is it? It's sin. Daniel didn't say that. James, by the inspiration of God, said that. If we know we need to do it, and we neglect to do it for whatever reason, and maybe it's a good reason in our minds, but it doesn't give a reason for the neglect. It just says if you don't do it, and you know you can, to you it is sin. I don't know how you get around that verse. And if we keep that in the forefront of our minds, it really, I believe, keeps us in check of where you and I need to be. Let's think about some things that we can apply from this. Duty is inescapable. Would you agree? You may say, well, Jonah escaped it. No, he didn't. He evaded it for a little while, but he still didn't escape it. Even in the depths of the Mediterranean Ocean, in the belly of a great fish, Jonah still did not escape his duty. You can't get away from it. You may not do it. You may choose not to do it. You may not carry it out, but that still doesn't mean that we have dodged, if you will, or escaped what God expects us to do. You can't escape it. And we can't escape judgment either. A lack of desire, think about this, a lack of desire and interest and my lack of care or whatever reason that I don't want to go to Nineveh doesn't change it, does it? Jonah didn't want to go. Not 1 ounce of him wanted to go to Nineveh, but it did not change the fact that God said, I need you to go. All he did was delay the inevitable. Because as soon as he came around, God said, remember what I told you? I still need you to go there. We can't escape it. And our lack of desire won't change anything. And our duty is non-transferable. You know, Moses tried to do this, and all of his excuse-making that he did and everything that he's trying to do to get out of God, saying, hey, I need you to go to Egypt and help my people. That was one of the things that he brought up. Just send anybody else. Anybody but me. Didn't change it, did it? He still needed Moses to go. Jonah could have said, I need you to send somebody else to Nineveh. I'm not the guy for the job. But, you know, God chose him for a reason. Just as he chooses you and I for reasons that we need to fulfill in this life. And we can't transfer that to somebody else. Now, a lot of times in life, that's kind of what ends up happening. Because we don't do something, somebody else is forced to step up and do what maybe we should do. But it doesn't transfer the fact that God still expects us to do that, and we're going to have to answer for that. Jonah couldn't transfer that to anybody else. And the only way to really be relieved of a duty is nothing that we've talked about thus far, but the only way to be relieved of it is just to do it. Not to do it to just get it out of the way, but to do it because we want to serve God. The only way to be relieved of a duty is to discharge that duty or to carry it out, and that's exactly what Jesus did. Those words that He said on the cross are so important. There's so many lessons found in those words. some of the most important is John 19 and verse 30. It is finished. What was it? It was his duty. What God expected him to do. The only way to be relieved of it is to carry it out. Now, I want you to think about something. Running from duty is a willful disobedience of God. I got a typo there. It says a will disobedience of God. It should be a willful disobedience of God. That's what it is. I think we've already established that. And in addition to that, it is neglect and misuse of our talents. And we understand from the parable of the talents how severe it is when we don't use what God has given us. But I want you to notice something. Let's go back to these verses here. Because what we see from neglecting to do duty, it doesn't just start today and end today. It continues on into tomorrow and the next and next. It's a downward trend. Notice the actual words here. Jonah 1 and in verse 3, Jonah went down to Joppa. Joppa was down in reference to the map from where Nineveh was at. Nineveh would have been going up to where God needed him to be. Instead, he went down. It's a downward trend. It's not a play on words. It's literally what happened. Jonah 1 and in verse 3, when he paid his fare on the ship, he went down into the ship. Still going downward, not going up. When finally they realized what was going on, the storm was getting bad, Jonah's thrown overboard, he went down into the sea. And then finally he went down in verse 17 of chapter 1, down into that great fish. You see the point? Fulfilling or failing to fulfill our duty is a downward trend. It only continually gets worse and worse because, practice makes perfect, and if we dodge one thing, we might be able to dodge a little bit quicker the next. And dodge more and more and more. And if we're not fulfilling that duty, it gets easier and easier and easier. And it did for Jonah. So, as we think a little bit deeper into this, what's the lesson for us? Well, the only way to escape the downward trend is to go back up. And that is to call on God, and that's exactly what Jonah did. It took him getting into the belly of the fish before he did it. It took a lot of downward trends, but he finally said, God, I need you. I'm in a dark place. It stinks down here. Have you ever thought about what it was like inside that fish? But in that dark belly of that fish, there was a lot of very enlightening things that went on in Jonah's life to the point that he could say, God, I messed up. And he calls on God and he gets himself right. He called on God and he was ready to commit himself to God's work. And at that point, God prepared that fish to get him out of there, and he spit or he vomited him up on dry ground. Literally, he came up. He went down, down, down while he's running from God, but when he finally turned to God, notice how quick he came up. That's how it will be for us as well. When we seek to do God's will, He will make amends for us to be brought up from whatever depth that we're in. But we've got to choose to do that. And I want you to notice what Jonah said. Remember, I go back to the definition of the word duty. Remember the idea of to owe or to be obligated? Notice what Jonah says here. Jonah chapter 2 and in verse 9. He concludes what he's saying here in his prayer here, and he says, but I will sacrifice to you. With the voice of thanksgiving, I will pay what I have vowed. Well, look at there. Jonah has realized that he's defaulted on his debt. Jonah has realized that he's not kept his obligation. Jonah has realized, and it took a lot for him to realize that, but he realized that he did not fulfill his duty. And you know what he says? He says, God, I'm ready to pay what I owe you. The question is, what do we owe God? I go back to what Peter said. We're not bought with silver and gold. We're not redeemed with earthly treasures. You and I have been purchased with the precious blood of Christ. So from that perspective, what do we owe God? We owe God our very best. That's our duty. To glorify God and to give Him our best. In whatever way, fashion, form, or ability that we can do so, we need to do that. And we need to think about Jonah and how he tried to in every way to get away from that, but it didn't change anything. God had still expected the same of him, and so He does of us as well. So we come back to the very simple verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. What's the summary of the whole thing? It's very simple. Do what God asks you to do. Fear God and do what God asks you to do, for this is man's all. Let's not be like Jonah and flee from what God expects us to do. Let's do His will. I know the task sometimes seems daunting, seems scary. We think it's just more than we can do. But it's amazing what really takes place when we seek to fulfill that obligation. God can fill in all the doubts that we have about ourselves. And really and truly, we don't have to do it. In other words, we don't have to tote the load. God will. Do you think Jonah was that good of a preacher that he could just walk up in a nation with nobody that knew him and everybody says, "Yay, Jonah's right, let's all repent"? I don't think so. God did that. God gave the increase. Jonah was just a means by which God reached them. And that's what He expects us to be as well. He expects us to be the go-between to reach what will He wants to accomplish. And He'll take care of the rest. It's not about our inability. It's about God's ability and what He can do through you and I. So the question is, are we going to fulfill His duty? Are we going to do His will? I hope we will. I pray that we will. My prayer is that I'll do better, and I hope you will as well. Maybe tonight you need to make some changes to your life to maybe fulfill your duties a little bit better, or maybe a lot better than you have been doing. But you see here a guy who thought he couldn't and found out that he really could. We need to be more like Jonah in the end, more so than what he was at the beginning, because God can do great things through you. If you need to change some things in your life tonight, you need the prayers of the church to fulfill your duties more, we hope you will. We'll be here to help you and to pray for you in any way. As always, what a better time to become a Christian. To be obligated to God for the rest of your life and to be buried in a water grave of baptism with Christ. If you've not been baptized, let's do that tonight. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as we stand and as we sing.